Growing up in the Salvation Army for 17 years of my life was a blessing. I say that because my childhood was filled with pain and suffering, but the Fort Lauderdale Corps was a second home and a safe haven for me. It was at the Fort Lauderdale Corps that I started learning about Jesus Christ. Now, when you're a kid growing up in the early 90s, hearing about a man who can walk on water and heal the sick almost sounds like superheroes. But I learned quickly that Jesus was different from the superheroes I grew up idolizing because people actually worshiped him like a real person. When you're listening to sermons each week and singing the worship songs, sometimes there's this false idea as a kid that enters your mind. And it's this idea that because you worship with the people of God regularly, whether that's Sunday school, whether that's junior soldiers class, that somehow makes you automatically saved. That's what I thought growing up. I thought just being in proximity to God's people somehow that made me one of them. I thought because I was the only one of my friends that attended church, that made me better than them. But I was wrong. Now, that's not to say that the many moral and ethical teachings that was taught to me didn't resonate with me, because it did. But I was far from saved, according to God's book. It's because of that first bad idea that the next one would steer me down a path far away from the peace of God. And it's this idea that God is for my happiness all of the time. I thought as long as I lived a respectful and good life, God owed me. I thought if I prayed, he was supposed to answer all of my prayers. And he did. Just I didn't always get the answer I liked. But the opposite took place in my life. I used to ask God questions like, God, if you're for my happiness, why would you let my mother pass away? God, if you're for my happiness, why isn't my father in my life? God, if you really exist, why don't you care about me being homeless? Why am I stuck in a household with an alcoholic woman who tells me she hates me? See, to me at the time, if God really exists, he'd care about my happiness. He'd care about how good I felt. I used to imagine that I was supposed to have this kind of family you'd see on television sitcoms like Full House. And because I didn't have that, I felt like God was against me. And I got to a point where I even questioned whether or not God was real. See, to me at that time, if God really exists, then he would have cared about my happiness. I was in a valley of the shadow of death, and God didn't seem to be anywhere around. But through the hardships of many obstacles, God used the people of the Salvation Army to draw me close to him. I was fortunate enough to attend TYI one year, and I heard this story about Daniel. And what resonated with me from hearing that story is that Daniel and his friends, they were snatched away from their homeland by an evil king. They lost everything. But Daniel didn't turn away from God. In fact, he used the hardships of his circumstance to honor and glorify God. And that hit me, because hearing that, it made me realize that, man, maybe I'm not as faithful as I should have been. It's true that a lot of people sinned against me and brought pain into my life. But in that moment, I realized how much of a sinner I truly was. And it was there at TYI that I accepted Jesus Christ in my heart, repented of my sin, and trusted in him for salvation. Not long after that, the Fort Lauderdale Corps found out about my circumstance, that I was homeless. And even though I lost my mother at a young age, I gained a new mother. She brought me into her home, treated me like a son, loved on me, and it's because of that leadership that I feel called to be a Salvation Army officer. Thank you.